Welcome to the video segment of class today, and I'm really excited to kind of share this information with you. The churches in America, especially evangelical and fundamentalist churches, have gone through some interesting transitions on how church is viewed. Really, prior to the mid-60s, there wasn't a lot of emphasis put on evangelism or church growth stateside. Churches after World War II or late 40s, early 50s did a lot of evangelism in Europe and other areas where the GIs had been. Worldwide evangelism was important at that time. But really focusing on how churches functioned in America was really not their primary emphasis. However, in the late 60s, early 70s, a man by the name of Donald McGavran came back from his mission work in India, and he had established, I think, something like 1,800 churches in India, had come back to the U.S. and was stunned that the Presbyterian church that he was a member of was actually shrinking in size. And he was floored by that the churches around the world were growing and that many churches in America were shrinking. So he moved to Fuller Theological Seminary and established a center for church growth. And that center for church growth has become one of the foundations of how American churches have understood themselves through the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. And for many churches today, still kind of their foundational understanding. In the meantime, then in the late 80s, a group of people began to question kind of these church growth principles, which we'll talk about later, but primarily the idea that churches are defined as good or bad churches primarily based upon how they're growing numerically, that somehow if you aren't growing numerically, you're not in God's will. And so a whole other movement of church health, as you'll see here, developed kind of in opposition with the church growth and the church health field. And so kind of historically comparing the two, you'll notice in the church growth that they kind of came out of Fuller Theological Seminary. They developed various church growth institutes around the country, some in Indiana, some in Houston, Texas. And a fellow even by the name of Ken Callahan began to do some studies in what were the kind of tools that help churches grow, ways to study churches in such a way sociologically to help churches grow. And eventually even the megachurch models, the 80s and the 90s, the Willow Creeks and the Saddlebacks, all of these churches are rooted in this church growth movement. Now in opposition to that, there's this church health movement that said, there's really more to churches than size, and it was really established by the Alban Institute, which by disclaimer purposes, I'm one of their readers on the board, so I might be a little biased in this presentation. But they really looked at churches in terms of congregational systems. Were they healthy? Were they good relationship kinds of places? Were there places that treated people well? And they even moved into church life cycle theory, the idea that some churches will grow and die and that's normal, and even then congregational change theory that says churches need to adapt to environments that may or may not have to do with church growth. So you've kind of got these two movements that are dominant in American thought that have been in opposition to one another, and they can end up being in conflict with each other. So let's kind of look at each of these two a little more in depth on the next slide. In the church growth movement, I think there's several things to remember about the church growth movement. Number one, and first and foremost, is the idea that you define churches as being healthy based upon numerical growth. They look at Matthew 28 and other models and say the reason churches are here are to save the lost. And if they aren't saving the lost, they aren't growing numerically, they aren't baptizing a certain number of people, then they must be out of God's will. Now, that's an overarching idea. Under that, then, certain kind of sociological principles began to shape that movement. Number one is the homogeneous principle. And it's the idea that people are uncomfortable attending churches that have people who are different than them that attend. Now, are you hearing what I'm saying? And that we should lower the hurdles sociologically that keep people from attending church. Now, think about the implications of this. So what they're saying is if I'm a non-believer and I'm interested in going to church, I want to go to a church of people like me. So what I need to find is a church of mostly 50-year-old, white, upper middle class people who I would feel comfortable around, rather than perhaps a ethnically diverse, lower income kind of environment that make it me more difficult and uncomfortable there. So if they believe that, then what they did is they believe you should establish churches based upon social economic status and draw people to those. So you end up with the Saddleback churches in Southern California who actually had Saddleback Sam as the person that they wanted to bring in, which is a white, well-to-do Southern Californian. Second idea is the diagnostic principle. You should then study the area around the church and see what kind of people live there, and then you build this church that meets the neighborhood needs around them. Third are growth principles. They believe that there are ways that you go about reaching out to people and being involved in their lives that cause you to grow rather than shrink. And finally, the infrastructure. They had a very strong belief in infrastructure that says like celebration, congregation, and cell. In other words, you wanted Sunday mornings to be this big celebration. Then you broke them into smaller groups, Bible classes or groups of 100 or so that do congregational kinds of service projects and outreach and meeting people's needs. Then you broke them into cell, which is small groups of 10 or 12. Sound familiar? Perhaps you attend one of those churches now. And the idea then is to assimilate, involve, and reach out. The funnel concept of bringing people into church. This all comes from Donald McGavran. This really were not principles that churches were involved in until the late 1960s. Some of the key leaders, we look at the next slide, that may tell us about this. People who really shaped that movement are people like Donald McGavran. He wrote several books, Bridges to God, How Churches Grow, Understanding Church Growth. He's kind of the father of that. A guy named Virgil Gerber, who's really strong in the Baptist churches, who wrote a book that most Baptist churches used for years, God's Way of Keeping a Church Going and Growing. Within Churches of Christ, at the center of church growth out of Houston, with Schubert, Matheny, and Ellis, John Ellis and Tim Matheny and Joe Schubert. They took these principles and they applied them all across Churches of Christ, really kind of a shaping element in the 1980s. I went to one of their seminars. They gave me this great little notebook. Here's how you grow a church. Go back to your church and make it happen. More recently, a fellow by the name of Christian Schwartz has written a book, Institute for Natural Church Development. He's kind of taken their language and updated it more postmodern views, but still down deep, Schwartz believes that this is how you grow people and cause churches to be in God's will. And then some of the big names in church growth in the last 20 years, Rick Warren at Saddleback, Bill Hybels at Willow Creek, and Bob Russell, Southeast Christian, all churches of 10,000 or more who've all bought into this particular model. Remember, what this model is that churches have to grow numerically. We need to sociologically build churches that meet the community around them, and then involve certain principles, sociological and biblical, that cause these churches to grow. All right, next slide. The things you want to remember about the Auburn side, the church health side, is kind of a change. They said, look at this and this is great, but that doesn't describe every church. And what about the little inner city church or the church in the small town? What about the church who for all kind of reasons is not growing? Does that church not matter anymore? And they said, let's redescribe church in such a way that people can feel like they belong rather than feel like they're ostracized if they're not growing. So the Auburn group came back and they described church in more organic terms. They used a family, the concept of a body, and they really, kind of taking those biblical principles out and saying, if they're really family and body, do they not function as family and body? And kingdom emphasis, they said, is more than congregational emphasis. And what they mean by that is they believe that some churches will grow, some churches will die, some will get bigger, and some will shrink. And really, that's okay in the larger kingdom concept, that maybe that's what God had in mind for churches, is to have a life cycle and to die, and we shouldn't get so upset for every little dying church as long as kingdom is reaching out and doing other things. That's significantly different than the previous model. They also said that congregations do not have to grow numerically to be in God's will. that God may want a church of older, dying people who can do other things and serve community, and we shouldn't be judgmental of people who don't reach out, and that congregation functioning is more about the movement than it is about growth. I didn't say that very clearly, so what I mean by this is, how healthy is the church? How do they treat one another? How kind are they? That's more about kingdom to them than whether they're bringing people who are lost to Christ. Now, these two groups aren't mutually exclusive, but I think that they tend to end up in competition with one another, if that makes sense. And you will have people in church who come from those two different points of view. There will be those who say, hey, church is about reaching the lost. And other people say church is about my family. And they conflict. Next slide. I want to talk a little bit about some of the key leaders. Lauren Mead, who helped establish the Alban Institute, wrote a seminal book, The Once and Future Church. If you kind of want to know about the original thinking in that field, this is it. Robert Dale wrote a book called To Dream Again, who described the church as a life cycle, and we'll talk about this at another time. Edwin Freeman is one of the key authors in the field. He wrote Generation to Generation. Peter Steinke, How Your Church Family Works, Gil Rendell, James Hopewell, Speed Lees. All of these are people who said, let's look at church organically rather than linearly. One more slide. And so that kind of puts us in this mode I want you to think about. When you go to church on Sunday or you're leading your congregation, you're dealing with people, you've got people who've been shaped, whether they know it or not, by two distinctly different fields of thought. One field of thought is church only is in God's will if we're reaching the lost. They're going to be on your missions committees. They're going to be the outreach people. They're going to make you feel guilty for not spending money in a certain arena. They're going to want to know why you're building this new building when you could be teaching other people about Jesus. That's one side. The flip side are the people who say, church is really about relationships. It's really about the connectedness that I have with people. It's about kind of functioning as this healthy whole, and we don't really need necessarily to reach out to other people as long as we're doing what God wants. And if other people are drawn to that, that's great. And the bottom line in my mind is you're going to have to learn to deal with these two entities. Are they exclusive? No. Perhaps you can be a church that is both church growth and congregationally healthy. Perhaps you can be the kind of church who reaches out to others while primarily being interested in relationships at church. But I promise you this, in terms of conflict, these are one of the key areas that you will have to manage conflict congregationally between the church growth and the church health movement. Thank you.